Hello lovely people, welcome to my non-fiction November wrap-up.
Doobie 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 doo doobie 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 Sophie vlogs.
First of all, I just want to say that, as per usual, non-fiction November has been an absolute delight. I have loved watching everyone else's videos as well as reading all of these books. I'm just going to dive into it because I have a fair few books to get through and we're just going to whiz through them all. So, I kicked off non-fiction November in a typical Sophie fashion by immediately abandoning the TBR I had set myself. So the first book I read was Paris, Biography of a City by Colin Jones, which I'm choosing to fill the sport prompt because she's dancing, and dancing is a sport. But I read this because at the end of October I went to Paris for the first time. My partner was reading this while we were in Paris, and then he gave it to me to read when we were back, and I'm actually really glad I read it after being to Paris, because a lot of the stuff that's talked about in this, it was really helpful being able to know what it looks like and to know like how the city is laid out and stuff like that. So I actually felt like that made reading this a lot better. This is what it says on the tin. It is a history of Paris. It is very, this sounds like a really stupid thing to say, but it is very specifically a history of Paris, not a history of France. So there were lots of moments in this where sometimes history is skimmed over slightly because it doesn't super relate to the city itself. So like various things to do with like the French Revolution and stuff, if it's not happening in Paris then it's not really covered. Occasionally, sometimes that was fine because it meant that you sort of like just kept on going and you got like this real overview of the city, which was really cool. Other times there were a couple of things where like a great moment in history is covered in like a sentence and I was like, hang on, would like a little bit more info. So occasionally that was a double-edged sword. But on the whole, this was really interesting. It sort of starts in Roman times, works up to the time it was published. I think this was published in about the 80s or 90s, I can't remember which one. So it's not a wholly contemporary, but it is really interesting to get such a overview of Paris is one of these iconic cities, and it starts with this quotation which was really interesting, which is this quotation all about how you never see Paris for the first time. You're always seeing Paris, like, I went to Paris for the first time, but I already knew what Paris looked like. I knew what the Eiffel Tower looked like. I knew what Notre Dame looked like. All of these iconic pieces of Paris. I already had a sense of what Paris itself looks like. So even before you go, it's such a thing that is beyond just a physical location now. Paris is like this idea, which is why you have stuff like Paris syndrome and stuff, where tourists come and then they're really disappointed because it's not as magical as it is in their head. So we have this idea of Paris, and one of the things that I found enjoyable about this is seeing how certain ideas are built up and about what the actual, okay, so like Paris as concept, what is Paris as place with history? So it was interesting. If you are interested in Paris, I think this will be a really great thing to read. It's down to you. I also just wanted to show you my bookmark, which I used. It's this cool guy that I got when I went to the Louvre because I really love these vegetable people and it seemed fitting. After that, I read a book that I got out from the library. That's The Life and Rhymes of Benjamin Zephaniah by Benjamin Zephaniah, which is Benjamin Zephaniah's autobiography. This was really interesting. I knew little bits about Benjamin Zephaniah. He is he does many things, but primarily poet, activist, that sort of thing. It was so interesting. I knew some stuff about his background. I knew that he had been involved in like some criminal activity and stuff back in the day. What I found most interesting about this was, I think, all of the political activism side of this was so interesting. So, well, actually, okay, I'll start at the beginning, talking about his childhood and about how his mum, just the way that his mum talked was always in rhyme. Like, rhyming was something that was a really big part of, like, his mum bringing him up. So, like, it makes sense that this is a person who would be drawn to poetry and stuff like that, and especially to performance poetry rather than writing down poetry, because he couldn't read for a very long time. And just the love of poetry and of just rhyming and of wordplay and stuff like that you can see as he grows up. And it's interesting learning more about how he did a lot of performance poetries, and he didn't just perform, and he performed in so many different like situations. Like, he would perform before like punk bands went on stage, he would perform at like political rallies, he would perform in all different locations. And the way he sort of talks about how he's always trying to get he's not always just trying to perform to people who are like-minded in their beliefs and stuff. He wants to perform to people who have different beliefs and stuff like that, because that's how you learn things and that's how you get other people's perspectives and things like that. He was involved in a number of sort of like big political moments. For example, like the Free Nelson Mandela campaign, the lots of stuff to do with like the riots and stuff in London. I was just, to be honest, he was so interesting, and the way he also moved from being like poet who's very politically active, who's doing a lot of this stuff, to also doing children's poetry and that sort of thing, and also his own personal struggles with, for example, infertility. I just felt like I went in not really knowing a lot about Benjamin Zephaniah, and I've come out, I feel like a good autobiography doesn't have to reveal everything about someone's life. You're allowed to retain privacy, but a good autobiography leaves you with a better understanding of what motivates and drives a person. What is it that has, you know, the important things to them? Who you just get a better insight into how they think, how they have got to where they are, how they approach situations and stuff like that. And I felt like Benjamin Zephaniah's autobiography really did that, and I would very much recommend it if you're interested in his work in any way. I have one of his poetry collections now to read, because I'm not actually super familiar with his poetry, and I really want to change that, having read his book now, so I'm very excited to dive into that soon. After that, I followed it with another autobiography, which is the first book that was actually on the TBR I set myself, and that's Over the Top and Back, Tom Jones's autobiography. This was lent to me. I used it to fulfill the prompt of voice, although to be honest, Benjamin Zephaniah could also fulfill that prompt as well. This is autobiography all about Tom Jones, the singer's life. I found this really interesting. I think some of the most interesting bits were to do with how he made it in the industry. Tom Jones, like, got his girlfriend pregnant at 15, grew up in a very small little Welsh mining village, very much could have just never made it as big singer that he did. So one thing that was interesting was that period of starting to gig locally and then making the connections and then moving to London and then trying to break into the circuit in London and blah blah blah. That was really interesting. One thing I liked about this is he sort of had like enough self-awareness to be able to be like, because like you have like an image of Tom Jones and there's like that like 70s hyper-sexed figure, and he like talks about that quite a lot, and about how it was kind of really strange and also a bit difficult to break that image and then to try and have career progression. So his is not a career that was just like he made it and then was infinitely successful. It was like he made it, and then because people had this idea of who he was as an artist, people didn't really want to work with him and blah blah blah, and trying to carve out different sounds and blah blah blah, all of this stuff. That was interesting. One thing that was quite funny is the absolute lack of discussion of any of his extremely numerous affairs. That is very much not covered in this book, and sometimes it's interesting if you read an autobiography and you do know stuff about someone to see what is left out. By all means, I'm not saying that Tom Jones should have gone into the nitty-gritty detail, because in many ways it would have been highly disrespectful to his wife, who he talks about quite lovingly in this. It is just interesting to be like, okay, what are you telling us? What are you not telling us? Autobiographies can sometimes be a really interesting like study in a vehicle. How are you telling us this story? What are you choosing to share? How are you structuring this, and that sort of thing. On the whole, a fun, enjoyable autobiography. Definitely enjoyed it. Moving on to the book I picked for the design prompt, I read The Golden Thread: How Fabric Changed History by Kassia St. Clair. This was absolutely fascinating. This is essentially looking at how fabric changed history, but we sort of use each chapter as kind of like a different case study. So like you start off in like Neolithic times, you go and look at like the importance of wool to Vikings and how like wool was used for all of their sails and the crazy workload that goes into doing that, and then lace and all of the historical ones I knew I was going to be really interested in, and I really was. What I wasn't expecting to be so fascinated by was some of the more contemporary chapters. For example, there's a chapter all about the types of fabric used for mountain climbing, specifically stuff like Everest, because this is this situation where all the normal rules of like fabric and stuff are off because you're in such extreme conditions. How people went about dealing with that was fascinating. And in a very similar way, there's a whole chapter on the fabric used for spacesuits and space travel, because again, these inhospitable conditions. How do you deal with that? So like the mission that went to the moon, all of their spacesuits are being made by this factory that makes like undergarments, and it's just like these ladies, and they have all the practical knowledge, and they had to hire someone to do all the high tech, to do all the like super detailed design like briefs to give to NASA, because NASA wanted all this stuff written down, and the women are like, we just make it because we know how to make it. I don't know how to write it down. That was so interesting, as was also the chapter all about swimwear technology. When I was in school, I did a textile art A-level, and you had to do like a written piece, and I did this whole project all about the history of swimwear, and I looked at contemporary swimwear and all of the new fabrics that are being designed for the Olympics and stuff, and that was right at the time, which is talked about in this, where there was the huge controversy at the Olympics all about all of this fabric technology that was giving people unfair advantages, which is now banned. And just I knew the history side would interest me because I am interested in history, and it was super fascinating and it was really interesting. I was not expecting to be so gripped by the contemporary chapters. Oh, and also the final chapter is all about these spiders and these people who are trying to make fabric from spider weaving and stuff. It's so interesting. This potentially is the highlight book of non-fiction in November for me. I absolutely loved it. I really want to read her next book, which is all about colour. It's just a really great way of sort of looking at human history, but also like through such an interesting lens. And it's really made me appreciate how much fabric is a part of our life and how I like approach it and stuff like that. It's so great. The next book was also very interesting, but for completely different reasons. I read Honourable Friends by Caroline Lucas. It's Caroline Lucas writing about her first term as the only Green MP in Parliament. Why this was particularly interesting is, as of filming this, and if I post it on time, we're about to have a general election, and everything is happening. It's all up in the air in British politics right now. It's a bit of a mess. I wasn't expecting so many of the topics she talks about in this to be so hyper relevant to the current election we're having. Obviously I was expecting her to talk about climate change because she is a Green MP and that's sort of their thing, but also so many other things in this, and not even particularly like discussions of the EU and stuff, which are in this, which do relate to our current like whole Brexit situation, but just a number of discussions in this, like fracking, like stuff like this, are things which are really hot topics in this current election like campaigning season. And it was so interesting to get this perspective from 2015, where she's coming out with all these observations of the Conservative Lib Dem alliance government and stuff, and I feel like there are some real repercussions of that government that are playing out now, which was very interesting to contrast. At times it made me feel a little bit sad of she's saying all these really relevant things in 2015 and it's 2019 and we haven't really addressed some of them, and we're just starting to push to address some of them, which is good, but I kind of wish we would have addressed them sooner. But on the whole, this was really interesting. I feel like even if you're not someone who is a supporter of the Green Party or stuff like that, I still feel like there are things with this which will be really interesting for you. For example, she has a whole chapter all about reforming, like electoral reform, and how we should, the different ways in which we could reform our election system so that first past the post is not the method that we use, and how like different other options are currently used in like local elections and blah blah, and how maybe we should start to incorporate those into bigger elections. Things like that. I feel like even if you're not someone who is like, oh, I'm a Green Party member, you could still really find stuff in this that would give you things to think about and to consider. So I would recommend this. I thought it was really great. Next up is a dinky little book which I actually mentioned in my autumn TBR, but I thought I would save it for November to tie into Non-Fiction November. That's The Secret Life of the Owl by John Lewis Stemple. I've talked about John Lewis Stemple a number of times on this channel. I really enjoy his nature writing. I've read a similar book which was all about oak trees. This one is all about owls. It's just looking at specifically the owls that are native to Britain. It sort of gives you like profiles of different types of owl. It does his usual thing of like, here's some poems of owl. What are not just the like owls' behaviour in this country throughout the seasons and stuff like that, but also what are owls interpreted as in like religions around the world, in poetry. How do we approach them as people and a society, as well as how do they themselves function? It is so small. It was such a lovely little just like intro to owls. I have a bit of a better understanding of the differences between the different owl breeds that live in Britain. And on the whole, it was just really lovely. It was a nice, sweet little break in between. The Caroline Lucas book made me feel quite like, oh, politics, whereas it was just nice to do like little, okay. My penultimate book is the other one that I mentioned in my TBR, which is, oh, I've forgotten the prompt that this ties into, I can't remember, but Forbidden Lives, LGBT Stories from Wales by Norena Shopland, forward by Jeffrey Weeks. This is, as it says on the tin, all about Welsh LGBT history. Each sort of chapter is looking at a different figure or figures who either are Welsh or ended up in spending a lot of time in Wales and being like considered Welsh, that sort of thing. So not all of the people who are talked about in this were necessarily born in Wales, but they do also like have ties to Wales. This was another one which was kind of similar to the Fabric book, where I knew I was going to be really interested in the historical figures because I always am. I really like history. What I found really interesting was when we got into more modern times and specifically like the role of particular Welsh MPs and stuff like this in trying to repeal the criminalisation of homosexuality. That was really interesting because that was something that I didn't know a lot about. I knew sort of roughly when things were repealed, but I didn't really know like the ins and outs of like who was campaigning for how long and blah blah blah, so that was really interesting. One thing I will say about this is from a very small press, so I'm saying this just to acknowledge it. I'm not being like, how terrible. Quite a few proofing things that I picked up on in this. I should say, as part of my day job, I am a proofreader, so I notice things a little bit because I can't really turn it off anymore. There were quite a few proofing mistakes in this. Sometimes it was just like little bits of like, I'm like, oh, a comma should be here. Other times it was like a full stop in the middle of the sentence, some misspellings. My only one that I really want to just address is the consistency of formatting trans men and trans women. Trans men is always written as one word in this. Trans women was sometimes written as two words and then at other times written as one word. I feel like, if I am correct, the general consensus currently is it's better to have them as two words because trans is an adjective. A trans woman is the same as like a tall woman rather than like it being like one word. But also just consistency. If you're going to do one or the other, just consistently do it. But I feel a little bit pernickety. It was only because in regards to that particular wording, there is like a critique there about having things separate, but also Norena Shopland and her credentials in the back has done a lot of work for LGBT organisations and stuff like this, so I don't want to be like, hey, I know more than you, because I don't. I just wanted to acknowledge it in case anyone else is going to read this. Just be aware that that's the thing. On the whole, this was super interesting. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars because it just introduced me to a lot of new people. There were figures in this who I was already familiar with, but it did introduce me to a whole lot of new people that I now can go away and explore and that sort of thing. So that was really fantastic. The final book I read was another memoir, and that's Maggie and Me by Damian Barr. I got this in the queer book box. I felt like as a memoir, this did a really good job of being very frank, but also capturing how kids view things and experience things. It very much, you're always getting things filtered through this like childlike consciousness, which does mature as he matures growing up. I will give major trigger warnings, specifically for child abuse, and also suicide, alcoholism. There's probably a bunch more. Essentially, a lot of heavy things are discussed in this because it turns out that Damian Barr had quite a tough upbringing. More so than just the usual toughness that comes with like growing up gay in this specific time. He did also absolutely suffer child abuse and stuff like that. So I just would like to mention that if this is something you want to read, just be aware of that going in. The thing that I gave this 3 out of 5 stars because I feel like it does work really well as a memoir. This whole framing of the reason it's Maggie and Me is because it's framed around Margaret Thatcher. So the back makes it sound like as he's growing up during the time of Margaret Thatcher's sort of residency government, that's what it's called. It makes it seem like she really, he was like fascinated with her and stuff. And the closing part of this really does he does like a rallying thing at the end where he's talking about how throughout all the hard stuff that happened to him, like, he looked at Margaret Thatcher, the way she carried herself and stuff really encouraged him to like push on through, and he refers to her as like his other mum and stuff like that. But that didn't really come through to me throughout the rest of the text. All of the chapters start with a quotation from Margaret Thatcher, which kind of a bit ties into the theme of that chapter somewhat. But her as and she's occasionally mentioned, but her as this figure who helps him push through and who he views as his second mother and stuff really did not come across to me. What did come across to me really well was the effect that her government's policies had on the town that he's growing up in, but also on Scotland as a whole, very much so. That was very clear. The way, the attitudes that a lot of people, adults in his life, had towards her, all of that thing, super clear. This aspect of her as helping him through his life didn't really come through to me. So I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars because a bit of a tough read sometimes, effective as a memoir. I don't think that this framing device that's being used was done as well as it could have been done. That's everything. I feel like that was a bit of a lot. I didn't realise how much I read this month that was non-fiction. I've had a cracking time. I would love to hear if you've read any of these, if you have thoughts on any of these, but also what was your standout read if you took part in Non-Fiction November, or what is your favourite non-fiction book you've ever read. All of these things and more I would love. My favourite thing about Non-Fiction November is getting loads of non-fiction recs and having really exciting things to dive into. Okay, gonna stop talking, gonna go away. I hope you're having a really lovely day. I will see you next time for something different.